Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, it's my great pleasure to introduce Bert Settles. Bert graduated with a PhD from Wisconsin Computer Science Department. Then he did a postdoc with Tom Mitchell at Carnegie Mellon. Now, his most well-known famous book is a survey book on active learning. And he's also very famous for writing songs and performing in an actual band. Okay, so today he's going to tell us about interactive machine learning. Bert.
Thanks, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I'm probably more famous for active learning than for my band, but although sometimes I wish it were the other way around. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. It's been fun to talk to a lot of the faces that are here today and learn about what you guys have been doing. And so a lot of this talk is definitely preaching to the choir, and it sounds like a lot of things that you already know, but bear with me. Hopefully it's not still boring to now. But I'll start out by talking about the typical passive learning machine learning paradigm. You've got these three elements. There's a human expert who knows something about the problem, a machine learning system that you want to train to automatically solve the problem, and then you've got data, which typically starts out as an unlabeled data. And there's a bit of a bottleneck problem in that there's a lot of the data. If there weren't a lot of it, we probably wouldn't want to be training machine learning systems to solve the problems for us. So what got me interested in this is when I was a graduate student. Let me switch over here. One of my first projects was this information extraction system for biomedical texts. So this is a little GUI demo, which amazingly still works after a decade of not touching the code. And so the task here is to, given a biomedical journal article, automatically extract things like the genes and the proteins that are coded for by those genes and cell lines and cell types and things. So there are very related problems that you guys are working on, extracting names and addresses and phone numbers or people and organizations and locations out of newswire text. However, this was a less popular and less studied problem than those other things, and so there was a paucity of data for them. So the labeling bottleneck was very real, and that got me interested in how to kind of optimize that and make better use of the human's time. So if we were to assign a grade, to this paradigm, we have a machine learning student or something, then we'd probably give this a C++ or C+, but since we're computer scientists, maybe a C++. Darn, I spoiled my own joke. So the question is, can we do better? And I take inspiration from this quote: computers are useless, they can only give you answers. Maybe we can make them more useful if they'll ask questions as well. I don't know if Pablo Picasso actually said this, but the internet says so. So I can't find any definitive evidence that he said it. So this informed the active learning paradigm, where now we've got this cycle. Rather than just humans selecting some amount of the unlabeled data to label it and hand it off to a machine learning algorithm, now we can label some small subset, give it to a machine learning algorithm, then that algorithm can inspect the swaths of unlabeled data and hopefully in a targeted way make better use of the human's time. So here was an interesting, maybe negative result from my thesis work, where ignore this I don't know if I'm supposed to not stand in front of the light, but so ignore this chart for now. This is a typical learning curve where you have the number of instances in an information extraction problem. And what we would like to see is what we're seeing here, that with less labeled data, we can get higher accuracies, or in this case, F1 measure, in the active case versus the passive case. So this was for a real user experiment that I did on this biomedical named entity recognition task. So this is what we hope to see, and it's pretty typical. However, since it was a real experiment, it was actually logging the amount of time that the humans spent on the tasks, it was interesting to compare actual wall clock time. So this is the exact same learning curve, but where the cost function is different. It's actually time and not necessarily the number of instances. And it turns out, the instances that were hard for the machine to label, and so it wanted more information about, turned out to also be hard for the humans to label. And so the actual gains kind of washed out because we weren't taking the right cost function into consideration. So this inspired sort of a variant of active learning that I was calling interactive learning. It's sort of, interactive learning is maybe too broad, and it can be interpreted a lot of different ways. So like machine teaching or machine coaching or something like that is maybe more along the right lines. But the idea is to treat this process more like a conversation between the human experts and the learning algorithms. So we can let the human show some initiative by offering some advice about the problem. So we go into the problem presumably with some domain knowledge. Maybe it's not perfect, but we have an idea of what characterizes the problem. And let the machine show some initiative by a few different things. So one is asking questions, or active learning. And another is attempting to teach itself from all of the unlabeled data that it has available. And then maybe that can inform the questions that it asks and the types of domain knowledge that it tries to elicit from us. So this is a very mixed initiative paradigm in that both the humans and the machines have some agency and both have multiple ways of interacting with each other. So I'll make this a little bit more concrete throughout the rest of the talk. But what this might look like in this interactive machine learning or machine coaching sort of scenario is before any labeling has been done, just tabula rasa, the human expert has an idea. So this is an information extraction task of extracting like BibTeX records out of actual citations in a document. So you think the word proceedings, that's a good predictor of the book title field. All right, so this is a rule that I can just come up with. Another one might take a slightly different form. I don't know why it's not showing up on the screen. Okay, there we go. Another one is, I can maybe define a regular expression of 4 digits in a row. That seems to be a predictor of dates. So it could also be things like page numbers. So the advice doesn't even need to be perfect, but it needs to be kind of pointed in the right direction. And so the language of advice we could give, here's like a repeating sequence of initials that is probably indicative of the author field. And then I can come up with these ideas and then hand them off to the machine learning algorithm. And then it can take this. So far, no instances have even been labeled, per se. And the algorithm can inspect large amounts of data, and then through some semi-supervised learning, try to explain what it sees down here, given those rules, as best as it can. And then ask questions like, OK, well, there's this word conference that appears in the same neighborhood as proceedings. I think that might be the book title field, or can you label this feature for me as well? Or maybe, everything we've seen so far have been conference proceedings. I don't know what a journal is. Maybe you should annotate this journal citation for me. And then the human can turn around, answer those queries, give them to the machine learning algorithm, and this whole process can repeat. And ideally, the human can even come up with more rules or advice, domain knowledge at any time and inject those into the system.
You had no labels? Yeah. At what point did you inject labels? There are no labels.
And just at this point, when the algorithm asked for me to label this citation.
So these are fields, and you were saying the instance of that field is this segment? I still didn't understand what the task was, sorry.
Oh, so the task is, given a citation, segment that citation into the title field, the author field, the year, the publication venue, so on and so forth.
So I guess I'm confused by at which part do you specify the features and at which part do you specify the fields?
Yeah, so my thinking and the sorts of ways that I have been approaching these problems is a little bit different than it sounds like with the ICE system, how you guys have been approaching things. So you can think of a bag of words, of features, or these regular, all the features just already exist. Okay, and so there's no feature selection or feature generation. Right, so, but we can label the features themselves, and I'll talk about the machine learning algorithms for doing that in a few different scenarios. So part of the mixed initiative aspect here is that we can not only label instances, which in this case means segmenting and chopping up the citation into the appropriate fields, but you can also label features and saying, when I see this word or when I see this capitalization pattern or something, those are predictive of these labels. And then
Then you're saying it's positive.
right. So it's kind of a domain knowledge rule that you can provide without even being linked to any specific example.
And the constraint there is that this word only appear in a positive?
Not necessarily. So the rules could be imperfect. There could be noise in them, but hopefully the semi-supervised step would help it to sort of tease out, the contexts under which this rule really applies versus when it doesn't apply. So in the case of the conditional random fields to do this extraction, yeah, you can think of the algorithm that we use for incorporating this domain knowledge as a regularization term. So, and in a few minutes, I'll actually go into the details of how that works. So there's a couple of different research papers that I'll talk about that I would say falls into this paradigm. But before diving into those, I would argue that this plays to our complementary strengths. So machines are relatively inexpensive in terms of their time. They're high bandwidth. They don't complain to go through hundreds of thousands or millions of examples, whereas at least I would. And but as far as knowledge and intuition about the problem, the machines are kind of dumb. They're brute force, but if they already knew how to solve the problem, we wouldn't need to teach them. However, that's where we have our strengths. So the active learning helps to reduce the expense of the time spent on the task. High bandwidth kind of plays to the semi-supervised learning plays to the strength of the machine to be able to crunch through lots and lots of unlabeled data. And the advice-giving part of the dialogue helps us to take advantage of our knowledge and intuition about the problems. So if we can build a paradigm that incorporates all of these things, then that paradigm is maybe an A+ as opposed to a C++ paradigm. So I'll talk about these three different research projects over the years. Active feature labeling, a system that I built a few years ago called Dualist, and then briefly, if there's time at the end, I'll talk about a collaboration actually with Jerry about looking at Dualist in a kind of a crowdsourcing setting. And the first two are focused on mainly user interfaces and modifications to machine learning algorithms to facilitate this kind of dialogue. And the third section is kind of taking the camera, pointing it back at the humans to understand how the human behavior in this kind of system, what differences that makes in ultimate accuracy of the systems. So this was an EMNLP paper in 2009 with Andrew McCollum and Gregory Druck, who at that time was at University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So this is a sequence extraction problem. So going back to the citation extraction, we can think of the conditional random fields as a probabilistic finite state machine. So if we have this citation here, the extraction just corresponds to the most probable path through this model where the states correspond to the different labels. So MJ and Shervish are both self-transitions on the author state, Theory of Statistics, Springer, 1995, modulo punctuation. But okay, man, excuse me. So this is the underlying model that we're working on, but I'm not going to go into too many details of what CRFs look like under the hood. But to motivate this feature labeling idea, so features in this case are the input variables used by the machine learner. And a feature label is a rule, just a simple if-then rule that can express the human knowledge. So for example, these are the examples I gave before. If the word is proceedings, that implies the book title label. If it's 4 consecutive digits, it implies a date. If it's a repeating sequence of initials, maybe that implies author or editor. And the way we want to incorporate this information into the conditional random field, or more generally, any feature implies some probability distribution over labels, given that that feature fires for the instance or that token. And so here are some reference probability distributions. There's a lot of different ways you can formalize this, but let's say this rule implies that every time you see the word proceedings, it's a book title. Or every time you see the word, the digits, it's a date, and maybe half the time it's an author versus an editor. And it turns out the exact probability distribution, you can make this more and more accurate, but it doesn't seem to matter all that much.
Then I have a question. So imagine I use bag of word with one regularizer. And then the words that the teacher provides use a different regularizer because the prior is different. The teacher has more knowledge that this word is important, so it needs to be regularized differently. Now, with these two regularizers, the correlation between book title and proceeding and being book title is going to be learned with the new regularizer. Wouldn't that have exactly the same effect? But it's very easy to formalize if you formalize it this way. You have the bag of word with one regularizer and the word suggested. And you don't need to say, oh, proceeding is positive because I have data, I have labels, so it will infer the proceeding is positive. I don't need to specify, yes, it's always there because I have the data, I can infer it from the data. I just need to regularize it differently because the prior is different.
So how, I guess I'm not sure I understand the question. So in this case, you can actually do this learning with absolutely no labeled data in the sense that...
That is the difference, I guess.
Okay.
But if I have just even a little bit of labels, all these numbers, like how correlated is proceeding with book title, that will be very quickly inferred, right?
I guess it depends on how frequently that label, that feature in that context being labeled actually shows up in the corpus. But probably when you're sitting down, no work has been done yet. As a human, you sit down to think of these rules. You're probably going to think of the highest coverage, most salient, most predictive, most correlated sorts of features, at least at the beginning.
If you're going to use bag of word, you're going to need a few labels anyway, right? Otherwise, so you're going to have a few labels. The words you're going to put will have enough data. So I'm just wondering, if I put a prior, I have to think about, okay, that is in 75% of the time predictive of this. But now I have to think 75, is it 80, is it 90? If I just regularize it, I'll let the learning do the work.
Right, and that's kind of what's happening here. You don't have to think too hard about, okay, proceedings 90 or 80% of the time. This probability distribution doesn't have to be very precise because and actually in the next slide I'll show how we incorporate these rules. Okay. And so this is the maximization. This is the learning problem. This is the objective function. So so we want to minimize the KL divergence between all of these these reference probability distributions. So this is the feature label distribution that is generated by the fact that you labeled this particular feature. So this could be 100%, could be 50%, could be 80%. It doesn't matter as long as it's kind of pointed in the right direction. And then this is the expected model distribution. So given the current parameters of the model, I'm going to scan through all of the unlabeled data. And 90% of the time when I see this feature, I think it is this label. Okay? And I want to get these two distributions to be as similar as possible. And then so we repeat this for all of the rules that are available, subject to some regularization term to prevent overfitting. And it's a little bit complicated, but it turns out you can optimize this using gradient descent with LBFGS. You might even be able to do it in a stochastic gradient descent setting, but we were doing batch here.
So to your question, you could have the constraint that 4 digits meant the date, even though there were no 4-digit dates in your training data, and that this would force it to.
Yeah.
Right.
So this works with 0 label.
Yeah, this works with 0 labeled instances. And it could also be that the rule is bad in the sense that there are many 4-digit tokens that are part of the page field of the the ontology or whatever. But it could be the other contextual information, either through the rules or through the annotated instances. It's okay if we disagree some of the time with these reference distributions, because we're just trying to minimize the disagreement.
So that term, the left term actually is fixed. So basically it's fixed, and you update the theta, try to approximate that.
Right. Right. And you can also, if you have labeled instances, then that's another term. Your typical objective function for training a CRF is just another term you can add to this. And you could add weighting terms that, that the labeled instances are more important than the regularizers.
When we do that, it's basically because actually the right term actually you can the right term, for example, you use CRF, so that's the parameter you need to estimate. So it's I think this is like so this is basically a kind of regularization, right? So you try to have a better fit on the using CRF on the unlabeled data. At the same time, try to make the probability of predicting label given the same feature as
match the expectations that the human provides. Yep. Did you have another question?
I think you answered it, right? Basically, this can be viewed as a multiplier. And if you have labeled data, it's going to override it if you have enough labeled data. Right. But that is not shown on this slide, the labeled data term.
Right.
That's likely.
But you could, and in this particular research, we didn't actually have any labeled data. We were only experimenting with labeled features at this particular. But for engineering reasons, we didn't, we could sort of do one or the other at the time. But in theory, and actually since then, we've been able to train models that are mixed in terms of what types of labels are around. So, no?
Just a detailed question. How does this actually work for the sparse feature value? So, like the constraint, like the date, right? If it's got 4 digits, I think it's a date. If it doesn't have 4 digits, I have no guess.
Right.
So in this conditional distribution, when you're conditioning, is the sum only over things where the feature is present, or is it?
So the sum is over the feature rule, and this term is over the expected distribution of all of the tokens where that feature fires. However, you can, let me think of how to, so it's possible, for example, that 4 digits that are dates tend to show up in certain contexts. This regularization term, which is preventing overfitting, will start to push the parameter mass to things like what the previous token was and what the next token is, as long as the feature space is rich enough to include those kinds of features. And so it's not just memorizing that 4 digits is a date. This term is causing the parameter mass to sort of bleed into correlated features. And so you might be able to extract, even without any other labeled data, other types of dates, as long as they appear in the same contexts. Does that make sense?
So what I was saying earlier, that you needed labels, otherwise you would not benefit from bag of words, that was incorrect. Because you will have non-zero weight on the bag of words, even though you have 0 label,
Right.
because it's going to diffuse.
Right.
So this is actually very cool.
It seems like you have kind of a set of features, and they're independent in some way or separate. So to get this to work, does it depend on the set of features that you have, so that it would actually work for the scenario you're talking about? Like it has a rich enough set of features. So if I only had a date and a conference title, and I didn't have anything about previous or next words, then it seems like all I could
yeah.
label was a date and a conference title, and I wouldn't get anything else. So can you comment about the features you need to get this to actually work?
Yeah,
in
so
some sense?
that's a good observation. It's not entirely true in this case because the CRF, there's also some sequential information, so some of the information might bleed through the Markov, the transitional probabilities that are implicit in the model. But not explicitly. I mean, you could also even think about generalizing this to say that, oh, I think when I see this label 90% of the time, the next label is this, or the next token is this label. Those are probably harder for people to come up with, but those are other constraints that you could throw into this sort of model. But I think it's true that having some local neighborhood features, like just a very large, sparse representation, just throw the kitchen sink, which is at least 5 years ago what we were doing, is throwing the kitchen sink of features into these models and letting the statistics sort of wash out. So having like previous token and next token really is what enables you to make inferences about things that where the feature doesn't fire. But does that make sense?
That's exactly
Okay, yeah.
You've got to have those features, otherwise it won't do what you said about spreading the mass
Right.
away from conference to the
Yeah,
words
yeah,
around
that's
it
a
or
good point.
whatever, right? Okay.
So to make this a little bit more concrete, here's the user interface that we built. It's a little clunky, but it's research grade. And so what we have here over on the left is a collection of features that are being queried by the system. Over on the right-hand side, so these are organized kind of by distributional similarity. So these are different features that we think are related in some way, according to the model. So you can select a particular feature, like the word is Kaufman. And then over on the right-hand side, you see a bunch of examples of that feature being used in context, highlighted with a color of the corresponding label that the model thinks it should have at this time in the training process. So in all of these cases, it thinks that Kaufman is part of a publisher field. And then up at the top, you see the expected distribution. So every time I see the word Kaufman, 95% of those cases, I think it's a publisher. And then 1%, I think it belongs to an author, which kind of makes sense. Or maybe an editor field. And going back to the previous slide, so this is what the reference distribution looks like, which is maybe imperfect. This is what the model's current expected distribution looks like. And the regularization term is just trying to get these two pie charts to look as similar as possible.
So in this interface, does the system give you the word list and you as a user, you choose from that and label it?
Right.
This is, in some ways, kind of like active learning, active feature labeling, right?
It is, in fact, active feature labeling. And the next question is, how do we choose which features to present? Because we're exhaustively generating all possible, features. We have an algorithm for generating the features.
Yeah.
And there's millions of them, maybe. How do we pick the 100s that we're going to show here?
So you didn't do the case where a human teacher can
Right.
type in the feature and
Right.
say, I want to label that.
Right. So for this work, we don't even exercise that case. But the next section, I talk about an approach where you can do that.
So the KL distances, this is on a token level a token level prediction?
Yes, where it's a conditional random field, so a label assignment corresponds to a state assignment in the path of the token sequence through the finite state machine.
So can your Kaufman feature inform Morgan being a publisher?
It
It just
can.
via
So
the
if you
boolean?
have the feature, I don't think maybe we don't have it here, but you could have the feature, the previous word is Morgan. And the regularization term will force us to not just memorize that Kaufman means publisher, but a correlated feature with that is that the previous word was Morgan, and the transition probabilities from publisher to publisher are perhaps higher than they are for other things. And so it kind of implicitly learns that Morgan might have that label as well.
I see. So with that effect in the modeling, can you restrict yourself to unigrams and you get away with kind of most? And so let's say there's a lot of Kaufman that's anti-Kaufman or something.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a publisher. You need the Morgan in there. Is the
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, currently, like I said, 1% of the time it thinks that Kaufman is an author. So there's clearly something else that's informing those decisions. And I mean, I can't speak to exactly what it is, but it could be that the previous word being Morgan is one of the things that it's using as a predictor that 95% of the time it's Kaufman. This particular sampling of things doesn't show any predictions other than publisher, so I don't really know. Now, given like some of the things that I saw with the demo of ICE, one thing that an interface like this could benefit from is, okay, show me I'm going to select Kaufman and author, so show me all the cases where we think it's author, and that might really inform either false positives or some cases where show me more like this or something like that. Yeah. So that's another whole mode of interaction that isn't accounted for in this particular paradigm. Okay. So there's the question of how do we choose the right question. So ideally, we would like some complex but well-justified decision theoretic approach to select features to maximize some expected utility. So if we gave this feature all 10 possible labels, how does it minimize our uncertainty about but that's too expensive to do. So instead we use a more efficient approximation, which is just the expected uncertainty of all the tokens of the label distribution for all the tokens where this feature fires, weighted by some term of just how frequently it fires. So we want to sort of an exploration-exploitation kind of thing. We want to explore things that we're uncertain about, but also restrict ourselves to things that are likely to have impact because they occur frequently. So this is the heuristic that we tried. Here is the results from a simulation study with 2 benchmark information extraction data sets. So one was the
So I'm sorry, what is the question? Is this a positive feature?
The question is, here is a feature, label it for me.
So you're trying to solicit the 4-digit regular expression.
Right, so
you have some corpus of hypotheses, so it's your bag of words, and you want to surface some of those as the candidates to
One by one, right?
one, or in this case, we're actually showing a bunch of them. So the form of the query is, I want to pick which 100 words to show in this interface over here. And then when the user clicks on one of those features, I can see what the model currently thinks about that feature. And then I can provide some feedback, like directed feedback based on my domain knowledge that this feature implies this label.
How do you do that? Where's the say Kaufman, if I want to say this is publisher?
Yeah, so there are these buttons up at the top. So I could click on Kaufman and then click on publisher. And you can see some of these, like eds implies editor. Data implies title. Programs, parallel language, I guess are all title.
Those are human labels.
Yeah, so the things in parentheses that are colored, those are human provided labels in this particular batch of 100 feature queries.
So in theory, you could have this d//d4 thing
Right.
as another entry there,
Right.
and the human can say this could be here.
Yep, so there's a couple of different ways from an engineering perspective you could do that. One is before any annotation is even done, you could give the feature generator, factory or subprocess a language to create these regular expressions. Another one is if we had the facility to inject new feature labels, we could just write the regular expression on the fly and then have it retroactively apply to everything.
So what is the grouping here? They're all group of 5?
Yeah, so this is a little less intuitive than I would like, but basically, out of the 100 algorithm, or out of the 100 features, we run a quick clustering algorithm and kind of like these are different clusters of things that show up according to the features that co-occur with those features. So we think the idea being these features tend to show up in the same contexts. So if we present them together, it'll reduce the cognitive load. They probably have the same label. And so I can just kind of go down the list within a particular bucket, and hopefully they all have the same label, and I can go through them quickly.
But you don't expand the label to the group. You just label one at a time, feature at a time.
Yeah, with this particular interface.
But why would they have the same label? Because in some way, if they are just like Morgan Kaufman 1992 doesn't have the same label as Kaufman.
Right, so they probably wouldn't, those two things probably wouldn't show up in the same cluster though.
Okay.
But maybe, I'm trying to think of another publisher name, you know, maybe the word press would show up here.
It's actually Springer and Verlag and Sam, because it's in San Francisco, California, Cambridge, that's all publisher stuff.
Yeah. So it's an attempt, without actually knowing, for the machine to organize these things. I mean, we didn't do too much research and engineering into the HCI side of this. They were kind of based on intuitions, but we didn't try many controlled experiments. Okay, so this is the heuristic we're going to use. Here's some experiments. We had two data sets. One was the research citation running example. Another was Craigslist apartment classifieds, trying to extract location, contact information, rent, utilities, etc. And we compared combinations of active versus passive learning and feature labeling versus fully labeling instances. And we evaluated the learner after 10 minutes using a simulated annotator, which the details of the simulator, it was something that had already been used in these feature labeling sorts of, in previous research on feature labeling with conditional random fields. So the details are in that paper. And here are the results. So after 10 minutes, this is the token level accuracy of active learning where the features were selected versus this sort of passive heuristic-y. We use latent Dirichlet allocation to sort of cluster the features, and we picked the most frequent features out of each cluster. So it's another hybrid. It's not really, it's passive-ish, but active-ish kind of. But it was the previous approach that had been used in these kinds of interfaces. And then this is active learning by selecting instances using uncertainty sampling versus passive learning so random selection of instances and fully labeling the instances. And the cost functions here, I don't have them on the slide. I don't remember exactly what they were, but empirically, in some user studies, we found that it took like 2 to 4 seconds to label a feature versus like 10 to 20 seconds to label an instance. So that's how we're estimating this, the time after 10 minutes of annotation.
Just to be clear, instance label, that means you actually have to
segment the whole thing. Yep.
Okay.
It was a fairly efficient interface where like you clicked and dragged and the whole token's highlighted. But
does it like update every time? So when you label, it doesn't refresh with a new set of features?
No. So you do all of the annotations and then click learn and then it retrains and then comes up with a new set of features.
So in like your simulations, like how many do they label in each batch?
So in these simulations, it's been long enough. I don't remember the details. I mean, I think we kind of assumed that maybe there was an instantaneous refresh or something in estimating this cost function, which in reality is maybe, if anything, it's probably giving an advantage to the instance labeling as opposed to the feature labeling.
How do you select which feature to?
Using the heuristic, the expected uncertainty times the log frequency of
So out of that list of 100, you use that to select the one?
Right, so we take the top 100 and then there's the oracle, the simulated oracle that says, okay, out of these 100, these are the ones that I want to label. So this experiment and the next one, so the results are even more stark for the Craigslist classifieds. In some sense, you can't really trust these because they're simulated experiments anyway. And one does not simply simulate annotators. So again, going back to if the cost function is the number of instances, yeah, maybe you get some great gains. But we want to see what this looks like in a real setting. So we ran a couple of actual user studies using that interface. So here are the results for one user annotating the research citation data set. And for this, we only did two conditions. So active learning for labeling full instances, which is the green line, versus active learning labeling the features. And here we see in 10 minutes of work, we get significantly more accurate extractors using the active feature labeling paradigm. And the same for a different annotator on the same data set.
So the features have been like previously defined set of features. So
Yeah, you can think of it as like a bag of words. And then there are some context features and capitalization features, but yeah. The vocabulary of the feature spaces has already been generated in these experiments.
And is this starting from 0 examples, or did you do any starting from some number?
Start 0. So if you notice, these learning curves start at 2. That's because there was already 2 minutes worth of work done annotating just the most frequently occurring features. That's how we started. Or maybe we started with the LDA approach for the first batch.
So if you already had like a few thousand examples, do you think people would be able to label the remaining features in a meaningful way? Like, is it because you're starting off from tabula rasa that you can come up with things?
So my intuition in the next section, I have some evidence for this, is like I think you get more mileage out of the feature labeling early on. So if you already have 1,000 labeled instances, you may not get as much out of the. Actually, I'm not sure that's true. But I think this initial spike that we're seeing in both of these cases partially comes from the fact that we didn't have any information at all, and we're providing these very targeted, low-hanging fruit kinds of domain knowledge about the feature labeled associations.
How many active features are there in yours?
I don't know. It's no more than 1,000, because it's no more than 500. Yeah, it's probably not that. It's maybe 100.
So in 10 minutes, that's 1 per second?
It takes about 2 to 4 seconds. So another part of the reason I'm hesitating a little bit. What?
That is really efficient.
Yeah, actually, the feature labeling in both this paradigm and the next section turn out to be very efficient.
But do they spend a lot of time like deciding which ones to?
So this is the actual time that they spent. This isn't a simulation. So I don't know how much of. I don't think we went back and looked at how much time they spent doing one thing or the other.
It's 510 minutes. That really means like 1 a second.
I think it was 2 to 4 per, depending on the data set. One of them was 2 seconds per annotation when you take the amount of time that was spent and the number of annotations that were done divided by the amount of time spent. Turned out to be 2 seconds, I think, for this data set and 4 seconds for the other data set. Because it was 2 and 4 for one or the other.
So there's a UI, I have a UI question, right? So in this big grid you showed, when the user is labeling features, then do I run out of things to label?
Yep.
That shows 100.
Yeah, and then you kind of have to click retrain and wait for the next batch.
Okay, so whatever I labeled would not appear again, right? Because those are features that already received labels.
Right.
So we get a fresh grid of 100
So
things.
in this interface, you can't go back and revisit them either.
Okay.
So does that mean if it's that fast, then users are probably not looking at the examples context that much, right? They're just, because to click on an example, sort of see what the system thinks, and then either change their mind or label, probably take longer than 2 seconds, right? So they're probably maybe just
glancing
using their
at
own.
the context. Yeah, that's true.
But this is good. the features here are recognition tasks. They're not generation tasks, right? The users don't need to think about words.
Right, but like but you might want to see the context to know like what your label.
Yeah, that's still true.
Right, so then.
Why is CA publisher?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the clustering you have actually gives a type of context in a way. So it may be that that's actually why you can go fast because of that clustering.
Yeah, and you don't necessarily have to look at the empirical context.
So what is the first table you see? What do you get? When you have zero label, you get because there may be not one word in there that you ever see in a citation.
And I don't exactly remember what the first batch is. It's either the 100 most frequently occurring features, or we ran this LDA, the latent Dirichlet allocation, and then picked them.
Labels, so why would you get anything that is remotely related?
Well, you're hoping that by picking the most frequent or representative features that hopefully they have some predictive value.
With zero labels.
Even with zero labels, yeah.
What's
For
your
these
word
domains, right, the high frequency words are probably
Like proceedings shows up all the
because
time.
you're only okay. You're only seeing citations.
Right.
Yeah, it's in the citation world, right?
Right.
It's not generic.
Right. Right. So, I mean, everything that you're pointing out are definitely limitations of this particular implementation of the idea in general. So, did you have another question? Or okay. Okay, and then these are the learning curves for a third user on the Craigslist classifieds data set. So here the active feature labeling is winning all along. So here's the sales pitch sort of slide that, this is a new framework that we devised that outperforms passive learning with feature labels and active and passive learning with instances. But there's a dirty little secret. And you guys have been hinting at it all along. There's a few different dirty little secrets. So one is that the experiments are not exactly interactive. So what happened was the users worked on a particular batch for 2 minutes. And then they waited for the CRF to retrain, which took about a half an hour or an hour. And they went ahead and they did something else, and then the interface would ping them when it was ready, and then they would work for another 2 minutes, and so on. And so those learning curves, the reason they were kind of jagged lines that went exactly from 2-minute intervals is because they weren't exactly contiguous. So we were lying and cheating a little bit.
But still, it's kind of shocking that labeling instances would perform so poorly compared to labeling features, right? I wonder if it's an artifact of just CRFs being very hard to train.
I don't think so, because those results are consistent with the next section, which is using a completely different model on a completely different kind of task.
But even for just document classification, do you think that the labeling feature would still win?
Yes. I have evidence that it still wins. So, but some other limitations of this work is that the human can't volunteer the feature label, so you're restricted to just labeling the features that are queried. So ideally, we would like even tabula rasa before anything starts to be able to think. The word proceedings, it didn't show up in my grid, but I want to tell the algorithm that the word proceedings implies book titles. And we can only label features. It would be nice if we could mix the annotations of both features and instances. So because of this, we're not quite A+. We're at a B, better than average kind of paradigm, but we're not all the way there. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk about this system called Dualist that I built for interactive text classification, which is an attempt to address basically all of those previous limitations.
So before you do this, imagine I were to build a classifier for basketball. And it turns out
like documents, whether this document is about basketball
page, right?
Or hockey.
So at first, the word football is positive compared to the rest for basketball, because football and basketball may appear together or something like that.
Okay.
But after I have the word basketball, then football becomes negative, because so what happened is that they are so a feature can be positive first, then I put another feature, the difference between the two sets, now it becomes negative, then I put another feature that explains this negativeness, now it becomes positive again, And what happened is that since I'm combining the features in a very non-trivial way, the human intuition gets completely off as to whether it's positive or negative given the other features. Now, every single feature by itself we can predict information. We can really not predict in which direction it's going to push in the context of other features. Is that a problem?
It could be a problem, and this gets back kind of, I think, it was Jerry that asked a question about being able to revisit, feature labels and changing your mind later, which.
But this is not something a human can possibly understand.
So, but if he solicits the feature football, you can say it's negative, and the constraint is that in the margin on your unlabeled data set, that your model predicts that more of these are not basketball than not. It's not saying anything about the weight of the thing in your model.
I think you really want to go back to the conditional though, and the conditional given just football is positive.
Yeah.
What you're trying to differentiate is conditional given football and basketball.
Else.
Yeah.
And that's a different, which you could potentially ask about in context things, but that's a different judgment than what the overall goal is, right?
Right, but the information that the user provide in terms of how much information am I getting, at some point it becomes, so that's one approach. Then I look at another approach where I train a bag of word and I look at the weight of the different things. And there are things that I would have guessed they were positive because by themselves they would be positive, and then I look at the weights in bag of words and they're negative. And so clearly the two things carry different intuitions, right? One is in context of everything else, and but the humans can only reason in very, very limited context. So at some point the human is providing wrong information because the classifier is working in context.
So you can think about the human being able to understand that if this word appears and this other word does not appear, or if they both appear, then that's a different part of the if clause of the if-then rule. And you can imagine the active learning submodule of the system being able to notice these discrepancies empirically when the cross product of this feature being present or not, so there's these 4 different conditions. The label distributions are different, and maybe being able to synthesize a conjunction or a disjunction kind of rule and then asking you about that rule. I mean, this is something I'm just thinking about off the top of my head now. And that would help. It would increase the size of the feature space and make it more complex. And the search for generating good candidates for that might be really difficult, but it's possible. It's something that you could do to help with the situation that you're describing.
Well, my experience is that it works for the first 10 words, and then.
So I have a different interpretation of this, which is your intuition of the sign changing is the sign of the learned weights in the model. But if you look at the KL term that's actually in the model, they are not directly constraining the sign of any coefficient. It's a very different kind of regularization. And it turns out that will take care of the issue you mentioned.
In the case of the like a logistic regression with that kind of term, that's true.
You could have a positive feature with a negative weight in your model.
Right,
Yeah,
because all of these other features are overwhelming the prediction.
But what it means is that at some point you're giving the wrong hints. And if you suggest a feature and then it gets a negative weight, that means what information do you provide?
No, it could be that. It could be that just it modulo everything else, it's a positive predictor, but you have so much other information either through the labeled instances or through all of the other labeled features that it kind of overwhelms the model, and these are the real reasons that it's positive. And this other positive label just really doesn't contribute to the
So let me make
term.
sure I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
You're saying that the user suggests a word, the generalization error decreases, the model gets better, even though the weight is still negative.
Right. It could be that if the weight was 0, it's still positively correlated, but modulo everything else. But the objective term wouldn't change hardly at all if you just took the feature out completely. But again, maybe we can take this discussion offline. But yeah, I think Jerry was going in the right direction, where at least for the case of the discriminative model and this way of incorporating the domain knowledge into the regularization term, it kind of takes care of itself. It might even be more of a problem for this system, which is called dualist. So this is a text classification system, which, so let me, host, I think, is it 8080 or is it 80? Yeah, it's 8,000, sorry. I don't know what's going on. Well, that's unfortunate. Oh, there it is. Okay, sorry. Yay, okay. So this is a quick demo of the system. Where did I put this? All right, so it's just desktop, dualist master. There it is. Data. All right. I should have been more prepared. All right. So this is a sentiment analysis example. And so what the interface is doing, I can even, let's see if this messes things up to make it bigger. Okay. So what we have here on the left are actual documents. Which currently, because nothing's been labeled so far, so the documents on the left are randomly selected, and these are movie reviews from the standard sort of sentiment analysis task. And we have two labels here, positive and negative, and right now these are features, so bag of word feature representation, which right now are just ranked by their frequency in the corpus. But before we even do anything, I can think of the fact that, okay, in positive reviews, great and terrific are predictive of positive movie reviews, and maybe bad and terrible are predictive of negative movie reviews. And I can just click this button, and it's already incorporated that into the model. And now it's asking me, using uncertainty sampling, about some more documents over here on the left, and a ranked list of documents that it wants to ask if these are words that are predictive of positive and negative reviews. So if you scroll down, let's see, uplifting might be associated with a positive review. Oscar, good Oscar contenders. Perfectly, provocative, compelling, wonderful, superb, powerful, magnificent. On the negative side, we have waste, like this was a waste of time, stupid, laughable, dumb, wasted, pointless, ridiculous. Now we can retrain. So far we haven't even labeled any documents. Worst, sequel, and I guess Schwarzenegger is maybe associated with. Yeah, maybe that's.
Why are there fewer candidate negative words?
So this is actually kind of an artifact of the way I'm picking things, which a different way you could pick things. So in a couple of slides, I'll go into the algorithm.
There's
But
a sort of selected positive box.
oh, the selected positives are at the bottom. So you can actually go back and revisit and change your mind about labeled features in this particular case. Damn, Jean-Claude Van Damme is maybe a negative predictor. Awful, subtle, anyway, you get the idea. And so far, we haven't even labeled any instances. And we can look at, let's pause and look at the predictions. So this is, again, a research grade interface. But over here, this is the predicted label on the far left. This is the confidence of the model of that label. And then this is the actual label. So you're starting to see there's a few mistakes, like we're predicting this document, this review of species 2, we think is negative when in fact it was positive. But in general, you see there's a lot of parity between the predictions and the actual labels already, even though we haven't labeled any instances. And we haven't labeled that many features. And then we can go through. In this, no, we don't. Because there's sort of two modes. There's Explore mode, which is what I'm using here, which you don't need labels to be able to use the Explore mode. Then there's.
What I mean is you have all those orange, yellow things highlighted.
Right.
That's for our human benefit, right?
Right.
But there's no numbers on
Right.
it.
If I had tried Duelist in the there's also a experiment mode where it requires labels. Then we could get an accuracy estimation.
The second yellow column is the true label.
Those are the true labels. Right.
So it's about 90% accurate?
Maybe. Well, actually, if you want to bear with me a minute, I could very hackily, using command line grep, I could kind of figure out what the confusion matrix is.
I think it's about 90%.
Yes, it's probably.
Even better.
I'm not sure it's that high, but.
Confidence are scary, though.
Yeah, well, that's an artifact of the underlying model, which is naive Bayes. So let's jump back into the talk, and I'll talk about how this actually works. When this comes back, okay. So it's a multinomial naive Bayes because it's been known to work well for a lot of text problems. It's basically linear training time. I'll skip over the actual modeling. So here's a cartoon illustration of how the learning algorithm works. So we have our vocabulary of words. We've got 2 copies of each of these features, one conditioned on it being negative, one conditioned on it being positive. And then we start with your typical symmetric Dirichlet prior, or Laplace pseudo counts of 1, just to for smoothing. So if we have a labeled feature, so I can inject some knowledge by just typing in a word on this particular label. What we do is we just pretend like we hallucinated 5 examples where the word bad occurred in a negatively labeled document, and fantastic in a positively labeled document. And so we update these counts with the labeled features like so. And then if we have labeled documents, we can do a sort of variant of maximum likelihood estimation. So we have all these negative documents. We can update the counts for the words that appear in those documents on top of the priors that came from the labeled features. The same thing for the positive documents.
What's the total number of documents?
I mean, it depends on the data set. And what we were just doing, I think it's 2,000 documents. It's not that huge, but this is still linear training time. I've used it on.
No, but I mean the 5 comes from 2,000.
You mean the pseudo count of the pseudo? So it turns out it's not that sensitive to it. So I ran some experiments for different values of this, and it turns out, invariant of how big the actual data set is, it doesn't matter that much what this pseudo count is as long as it's less than 100. For some reason, I don't fully understand theoretically why, but if it's less than 100, it seems to work pretty well. And then from here, we can actually do one step, not to full convergence, but just for the sake of speed, 1 or 2 or 3 or a finite number of steps of the EM algorithm, where we can probabilistically label all the unlabeled documents, and then fractionally update these pseudo counts depending on the probabilistic labelings of the unlabeled documents, and then re-estimate the parameters based on that, and that is our final classifier. And then using that classifier, we can do the active learning steps by scanning through all the unlabeled data sets, selecting the most uncertain ones, and then also scanning through all the features and selecting the ones with the highest expected information gain. So the ones that have the largest difference between the expected uncertainty minus the expected uncertainty of the documents that have that feature present. And then what I'm doing is ranking the top 100 or 200 of those, and then organizing them into the columns by the model's expectation that this one occurs more frequently with this versus that label. And so the reason there was this imbalance after a couple of iterations was just because the most informative features tended to be more correlated with the positive label. But you could also do a ranking, choose a slightly different algorithm that would keep those more balanced. But so I'll discuss some more user experiments. What? Just to keep things fast and tractable and not necessarily run to convergence, you could also do 2, 3, 4. But the important thing is that it's a finite number of steps. Another thing is, I think empirically, I played around with this. And because the model is so strongly biased when you're labeling features, it can really run off the rails if you do more than a couple of steps. So there's 2 reasons. One for speed, and the other just to keep it from believing its own press, too much.
Did you ever try training a logistic regression on your expected counts to see if the probabilities look more realistic?
Training, I'm not sure what you mean.
So you do an E-step. So for every document, you have a fractional label of good or bad. Mm-hmm. So you could use that as your training data for your logistic regression.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So kind of using the naive Bayes as a proxy for the... So, I suspect that probably won't work that well because the posterior distributions from the naive Bayes classifier are still overly polarized. So, like Patrice was pointing out that those confidences looked a little scary.
That's the problem I was trying to address, right? Is that's
okay.
If I have 7 positive words, that's going to...
Yeah, so by retraining with the logistic regression, you're going to avoid the double counting and all the things that makes your probability crazy.
I think what might work better is actually trying some other approach where instead of naive Bayes, we're just actually using logistic regression and then incorporating either using the generalized expectation, like regularization approach, or something that is a little more computationally efficient and you can do incremental updates. That would be better. But since I haven't, this work is maybe 3 years ago and I haven't really been working on it since then. So that's a direction I wanted to go at the time, so for sure. All right.
A quick comment on this, right? Your duration prior with those addition of number 5, is that equivalent to have a pseudo document with
only
5
that
instances
feature
of that word in it and that label?
No, it's actually... Yeah, actually, I guess it is. Or five documents that have that word once. Yeah, that's true. Because this is a multinomial, it's the same thing as
Is it the same thing?
I think it's
close.
5 positives with the word in it versus...
You create 5 pseudo documents. Each one contain only 1 word, just that word.
And
copy it 5 times, and it's positive.
That should be the same as one document that has nothing but the same word 5 times. In the case of a multinomial logistic regression event model. If it's a binomial event model, then it's different. But
so I think you've demonstrated that in very short time, like in 10 minutes, you can get absolutely amazing results. Now, so there's this value there, there's unquestionable. The thing I'm wondering about is, does this method get you a reasonable accuracy super fast? But if you were to compare it with just building a model with labels the traditional way, how far are we in
So hold on to your seats. So here, this is a more exhaustive set of experiments than the previous paper. So here we use 3 different data sets with 5 different annotators labeling those data sets in these 3 different experimental conditions, and the order of the conditions was randomized to reduce some kind of presentation bias or like learning about the problem. So we use dualist in the flavor that I just showed you versus active learning on documents only, so this is no feature interactions at all, versus passive labeling of documents only. So we randomly select the documents, and documents are all that you can label. And we ran these in 6-minute trials with across all, to keep things consistent, there was a fixed 90% training set or unlabeled pool because they could actually label things differently than the gold standard. But we pulled out the unlabeled pool of 90% and then a fixed 10% test set. And so these are the learning curves for 4 different distinct users on the same problem. So this is the classification of university web pages into faculty, student, research project, or courses. So there are 4 different labels. The red line is dualist. The green line is active learning, but documents only. So the first thing to notice is both of the active learning sort of paradigms are better learning curves than passive. And the cost function here, the x-axis, is actual wall clock time with no pauses in between the retraining. This is actual contiguous, 6 minutes of work. The dotted line at the top is the accuracy of the classifier if we trained on the full 90% labeled training set. So in all of these cases, we're getting within 90% of the upper bound accuracy within 6 minutes with dualist.
So what's the x-axis on the top?
It's in seconds, so this is 360 seconds.
Or what's the difference between the bottom and top?
4
Nothing.
labels, right? You're looking at
4 different users.
Oh, 4 different users.
Yeah, these are learning curves for 4 distinct users on the same problem.
What was their interface for the active labeling and passive labeling?
So it was the same as dualist. It just didn't have the columns on the right for labeling the features.
So we hire the top right user.
This person seemed to get it right away and just really nail it out of the park.
So at the end of 6 minutes, how many documents did they manage to label?
Right.
And slash features, right? And you said like that dashed line is 90% of the corpus size, which would be like 1,000 something.
So in this particular, I think there's 1,000 documents there are 4,000 total documents.
So 3,000.
Yeah. So this is So this is training on like 32,000 ish labeled documents.
Yes. But for after 6 minutes, how many documents can people label?
That's a good question. I think I might discuss that in the paper, but I don't have it on a slide.
Probably not going to be more than 100.
No,
Yeah.
I think it's less than 100.
Yeah, it's not that many.
I was trying to read one of those. It's fine.
So these are the results for one data set. We get similar results for the science data set. So this was one of the 20 news groups subcategories with 4 different labels. I don't remember exactly what they are, but again, we can get it within about 90% accuracy of the upper bound. But the gains are even more stark.
Is the upper bound still in multilineal naive Bayes? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's the same model.
Yeah, it's the same model. It's just trained in a traditional supervised way.
So you said you're not testing against some ground truth, you're testing against their own labels, right?
No.
So you hold
So the
up
test
to-
set is consistent for every line you see, and it's the ground truth gold standard label that came with the the distribution of this benchmark data set. But it is possible that a user in one of these conditions gave a label that disagreed with the ground truth.
What percentage of data is actually about science?
So it's all about science. They're just different fields of science. So one's like astronomy, and one is, I don't remember what the 4 categories are.
Do you know what the most prevalent category is by size? Like if you
I
just
don't.
predicted the most common?
I don't. I think they're somewhat balanced in this particular data set.
For the dualist, they're allowed to do labels and like labeling documents and features.
Yep, they can inject features, they can label
how
features.
frequently they use the two, or
Right, so in general, I think I have a slide in here somewhere that visually shows it. People tended to start out, actually let me see if I can just find that slide because, yeah, here it is. So at the beginning, okay, at the beginning, it's fairly distributed. This is the amount of time, or the number of actions that they did, say, in the first minute, is pretty evenly distributed between labeling documents, labeling features, and volunteering features, so just typing in brand new features. And over time, they do less volunteering and less feature labeling and spend more time labeling documents. So. Probably because the low-hanging fruit has been picked.
So the feature suggestions weren't maybe as good after a while.
Right. After a while, the features stop being that interpretable, maybe.
It would be interesting to see if you could have people just label documents and then show them features and see if they get added value at some point of time. Like, is it only valuable in the beginning, or is it also valuable?
Yeah. So this kind of gets
on?
at. Somebody else asked a question with the previous section, and that's a good question. I'm not really sure. I think there would be still some utility, but it would be less. I mean, there's diminishing returns in general with all of these things.
So does the user have any sense of progress? I mean, can I tell that I added a feature to get better or worse? Do I have any idea?
With this interface, no. So like some of the things that you've built into the ICE system are really good, like the visualization of the spectrum of predictions and whether or not they're actually positive or negative, and you can kind of visually see where the false positives and false negatives are and then go in and try to understand why. I mean, none of that is part of this current interface.
Yeah, so why would anybody volunteer a feature? Like what's my motivation for doing that?
How do I get better at doing it?
Well, why would I do it in the first place, right?
Like, they don't know the impact, you mean? Like,
well,
right,
right, I mean, it's just like a little word.
It's a type of domain knowledge that you have that you want, like you come to the table kind of knowing this about the problem.
I mean, I can give a label, or I can give a feature, or I can type something in, and I'm not really getting any direct feedback of, hey, that was great, or that wasn't so great. So I have to make a decision on a policy without.
Right.
I think the question is, how do you make the teacher better?
Yeah, or how do you inform the teacher more? So
another way to interpret the curve is like, okay, the best is 98%. You get to 90% pretty quickly, which is 5 times the error rate. Arguably, it's not that great, right? I mean, you can say, oh, it's 90% of the accuracy, or it's 5 times the error.
Or 5 times the error rate.
Yeah.
In 6 minutes,
In 6 minutes,
as opposed to 2 weeks.
But I mean, there are many problems for which, handwriting recognition, 98% and 90%, one is usable, the other isn't. So
I think another way to ask a question about that is say, look, you did this for 6 minutes. If you had another 10 minutes, what would you do?
Yeah.
Like, this is only for running a study for 6 minutes.
Right.
What do you do to get it better in the next 10 minutes or 20 minutes?
So
to the full thing.
Do you have any,
another artifact here might be that you're maybe a little bit limited by by the classifier. So the next slide I was going to show was.
Oh, sorry. Is the 98% the human performance? Or
the 98%.
versus another human?
So the 98%, like this upper bound. This is using the gold standard labels for everything. So the results here were less amazing. The dualist still seems to be consistently better, and this user apparently was doing something right. But this is a trickier problem because sentiment analysis is tougher than like some of these other clustering. The other data sets were in some sense a little more clustery, and so the generative naive Bayes model captured it better, whereas you've got much more subtle and non-conditionally independent features going on with this particular data set. So it could be that swapping out, the paradigm for a logistic regression classifier would actually do much better here. And like what you were getting at, facilitating some information back to the human of what was actually learned and what actually went into making different decisions would be helpful in deciding, oh, maybe I'm going to undo this feature label, this kind of domain knowledge. So it's almost 5 o'clock. So I could either stop now or I could briefly, like I could power through a couple of other salient points. How do people feel? Power through? Okay. So here's an interesting failure case of basically a user who didn't label any features until right there. And then the accuracy started to jut up, but it wasn't. So basically, on the movie reviews data set, there was almost no difference in the behavior between the 3 conditions. So we didn't really see any gains. Here was another one where dualists started out looking good and then sort of flatlined and went crazy. And it's because the user, this was for the WebKB corpus, and this particular user basically after, 2 minutes or so of labeling, the features that were queried just kind of stopped making sense. And the only column that made sense was the course label. So they just spent all of their time in feature labeling land, labeling those features and not any of the others. And there wasn't a good mechanism in the training algorithm for this at the time, to account for that imbalance of the feature labels. So it started running off the rails, and the active learning with documents turned out to be better. And this is an open source sort of thing you can download and play around with. So these are some of the strengths, but there's this question of why it's not always better, and you guys have been getting at it. So we're A-. We still haven't gotten all the way to an A+. So can we get to A+? And I'll just power through this. So Jerry and I don't know, 3 years or so ago, tried to replicate. We used the data for a few different things, but one of them was to try to replicate these results using regular people or Turkers. Instead of all the users, I have a confession, all the users in the previous studies were graduate students in natural language processing and machine learning. So we kind of understood the problem a little bit more than in general. So the idea is, can we replicate these results? And maybe not. So these we had 32 or 33 different Turkers in these different conditions, try to train things, and basically just the learning curves that weren't statistically significantly different. However, if you look at the final accuracies, the distribution of final accuracies of the models after, I think these were 10-minute experiments, clearly some of the users who were given the dualist interface were doing better than the others. So the question is, what were they doing that helped? So let's review the different things you can do. You can label documents, you can label feature queries, and you can volunteer features. So these are the 3 different kind of first-class activities. And it turns out that volunteering features, that behavior seems to be really predictive of the final accuracy, at least in this really short, sort of 10-minute restriction. And some evidence for this. So we went through, and out of the 30 or something individuals in that group, we found these 3 behavioral subgroups. So 11 of the 33 didn't label any features at all. They only labeled documents. Or, they didn't volunteer features. They may have labeled some. Then there was a small group that labeled a lot of features, and then another kind of a third or so of them labeled a few features. I forgot what the cutoff was.
Type the words that's already in the list, did you count it as volunteered feature or labeled feature?
Yeah.
Even though it's already in the list.
It's already in the list. Basically, if it's in the list but not labeled in the list, then that counts as volunteering it. And if it's already in the list and labeled, then it's sort of a duplicate and we throw it away. Does that make sense?
But maybe when you volunteer, you can also enter far faster because you don't need to read.
Yeah, you don't have to scan through the list.
There's also the number of features created, right?
Right.
So
This could explain.
Let me just clarify. So there was this word like excellent in the list, and I didn't really read it carefully, but I thought about excellent.
And
So
you
even
typed
though
in excellent?
Yes, yes.
That would count as volunteering a feature. Even if it was already asking about that feature, that's not the mechanism through which you provided the information. And so then if we look...
Let me inject. This is the only mode that can be active learning.
What?
That's the point I was trying to make, but you don't have enough time.
Yeah. So anyway, these are the learning curves for the people in those conditions. And here we see some statistically significant gains. And this is a linear regression to predict final classifier accuracy as a function of the number of times people did these different actions. And the only one to have a statistically significant effect is whether or not they volunteered words.
Can you show it?
This?
So I think Patrice's point is a good one. That it could be explained by something other than the things you had listed there. It could be the number of features that they labeled, and by typing they could label more.
So that's
Right.
a possibility. It may also be...
You can include that in your list there for your cast. Right? Pointed out that
Yeah, I didn't really... I kind of suspect that didn't happen very often, but it may have. There's another explanation is that there's a hidden variable here, that maybe they're just good labelers, and the good labelers happen to also want to take advantage of this, this behavior. So it's correlated but not causal.
I would doubt it's the difference in the number of labels just because the time. I mean, everything's on the time axis there, and it would be surprising if Turkers were all that fast to typists, but really bad list scanners. Yeah. It should be a weird.
It might be faster to type than not scan. I don't know.
It wouldn't be consistent with like any other list scanner type study. So
They probably like
Maybe.
scan the list and select all the ones that are making sense there, and then this is measuring the stuff they're adding to it, right?
Yeah, well, all of the actions are included in this cost function.
I think there is a difference though, because at some point you're not finding any words and you have to scroll and scroll before you find one, as opposed to when you type, then you type one word instead of reading 100.
There's a real informational difference, but I don't want to take his time. So.
But those were actually the main points I wanted to make. Maybe we can still get to A+, but there's a lot of things to learn, and I think they fall. It's inherently interdisciplinary in that we want to. It takes research in machine learning to figure out, algorithms that compose questions in these different mixed addition of modalities, make use of the human domain knowledge, something that this is the next bullet point. So in human-computer interaction, there's both interface design, which I haven't done as much of, and it sounds like you guys have been doing a lot more, of helping the human to actually understand what's going on in the model, like actually understanding what the machine has learned. As well as most of the work I've done is facilitating the communication from the human into the algorithm in these different ways, but not so much understanding what the algorithm is learning, being able to go back and debug and error fix. And then there's also this human behavioral aspect of like, okay, what kinds of things do people tend to do? How do those impact efficiency? Are there ways to design the interfaces to encourage those activities? Because if you end up with these richer multimodal mixed initiative interfaces, now instead of one thing, the human can do 10 different things. And so, how do we optimize, getting the human to do the right things at the right times? So that's kind of all I have at this point. Only 8 minutes over. So.